Hello and welcome. Today's video is going to be about the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher who was born in 1844 and passed away in the year 1900. He famously went clinically insane January 3rd, 1889 in the city of Turin in Italy. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy is generally difficult to categorize because he did not create a system of philosophy. Unlike his master, who he never actually met, but who he said got him into philosophy, Arthur Schopenhauer, who actually created an entire system of philosophy. Nietzsche did not accomplish this. So it's not as easy to make a one sweeping statement categorization of his philosophy because it's not systemic. A system in philosophy is based on a first principle that is the foundation for everything else in that philosophy. Plato built a system, Aristotle built a system, Immanuel Kant built a system, Hegel built a system, Schopenhauer built a system, Nietzsche did not. Their metaphysics connect to their epistemology, which connects to their ethics, which connect to their aesthetics. It all connects and it's all one big unified whole. With Friedrich Nietzsche, because he was writing in an aphoristic style, not a syllogistic style, his philosophy was poetic, visionary, in many senses anti-rational. And we can really get into this exactly. So Nietzsche's philosophy is not as easy to categorize, but nonetheless I will make general categorizations of his philosophy, and I'll start with a few different works, and this is mostly just to be a general introduction to his way of thinking and many of his philosophical ideas. The first book that Nietzsche ever wrote was The Birth of Tragedy, and in my last video I mentioned a bit about that, how he had viewed the history of metaphysics and philosophy as taking this wrong turn, and that turn was a Socratic, Platonic turn which had confused metaphysics with ethics. And Nietzsche had argued that we need to turn and have a return to this distinction between metaphysics and ethics. In The Birth of Tragedy, what Nietzsche was doing was really making this distinction between what he called the Apollonian and the Dionysian creative drives, and that he had essentially said that all of art is this dynamic dichotomy between Apollo, the Greek god of sun, appearances, and order and symmetry, versus the Greek god of Dionysus, who is the god of intoxication, bacchanalic revelry, and ecstasis, or rather standing outside of oneself. So in ecstasy, in ecstasis, we are not aware of our own individual ego and self. We stand outside of ourselves. So the rapturous rock concert where we're all jumping up and we're all bouncing down together and we're all cheering on the rock concert and we're not thinking about Monday morning and all the boring stuff we have to do. When we're lost in that moment on a Friday or Saturday night and everyone's jumping up down in a crowd together, this is this Dionysian impulse. So for Nietzsche, we can essentially categorize all art and the artistic creative impulses in us as belonging to one of these two ways and modes of expression. And according to Nietzsche, as a culture, we had really gone down the Apollonian through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, which is the virtue of reason, the worship of our intellectual, rational, logical capacities to see a cosmos in the universe itself, an order in the universe. And this type of rationality and use of logic was what had led us, for Nietzsche, to this kind of Platonic philosophy. And what Nietzsche was saying is that what we should do, and what Nietzsche was going to do, was return philosophy and our creativity and our aesthetic drives, because for Nietzsche, philosophy is very much an art form, and that goes back to Socrates saying that to be a philosopher is to be an artist. So what Nietzsche was saying is he was going to return philosophy to this Dionysian origin, and we would finally be able to separate metaphysics from ethics. And so in Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, what he's saying is we need to ignore and reject to some degree the Apollonian, which has become too imbalanced, and we need to restore this Dionysian search for the wild, the rapturous, the uncontrollable, and all of the things that are put away by reason and made to be dangerous or irrational. And so Nietzsche was saying that as philosophers we need to look at the birth of tragedy in the Greek tradition with Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and various writers, Greek playwrights, and see that there was an alternative way of looking at the world and therefore discovering reality that we had neglected because we wanted to see the good and the beautiful merged with the true. And so what Nietzsche was saying is the good and the beautiful and the true are actually not synonymous, whereas for the philosophies that he was critiquing, they had become that way. So that's a general outline of Nietzsche's conception of the Apollonian and the Dionysian and the influence of them in our culture. So that was essentially Nietzsche's aesthetic view. Nietzsche as well is famous for his ideas regarding morality. And for example, Nietzsche was famous in Beyond Good and Evil, which was an articulation of the same principles in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that essentially that in our culture we had this confusion of morality with metaphysics, and for Nietzsche that culminated in Christian morality, and Nietzsche was very much against Christian morality. Friedrich Nietzsche had argued that in the Greek tradition, in this Birth of Tragedy, pride was a virtue. It was actually good to be proud. And to have this proud view of the world was this kind of Greek embodiment of the rationality and the supremacy of humanity on the planet. And our connection to the gods was through our ideal qualities. And so what Nietzsche was saying is that there had been this confusion with metaphysics and morality, and that had led us to this conception that there was a ideal truth that we would eventually discover. And what for Nietzsche, for Nietzsche's argument, morality became an instrument of confusion from metaphysics. And so for Nietzsche, what had happened was the Greeks had made pride a virtue. And with Christianity, what happened, according to Nietzsche, again, this is all Nietzschean critique, what Nietzsche argued is that there was a resentment amongst the priestly classes against those who were not rejecting their pride, and those who were actually proud of their ability to conquer. And so what Nietzsche had essentially argued is that the notion that pride is a sin for him was the resentment of the priests who could not actually conquer. So the sickly, weak priests who didn't have the ability to go out and conquer like the Romans and the Vikings, they needed to psyop and morally matrix the masses into believing that actually conquering is a bad thing, not a good thing. And that if you do it, you're going to go to the bad place forever. And so what Nietzsche said is there had been an overturning of all our moral systems. Before, we had a conception that what was good was what was proud and what conquered, and had this aristocratic elitism. And those elites defined morality for the masses. But what Nietzsche said is there was a revolt of the priests, the sickly, physically weak, who could not actually conquer, and so they needed to create this moral matrix of this other world that if you didn't conform your behavior to, you would be sent to. And for Nietzsche, that was merely a compensation because they couldn't actually conquer the world. So they invented a fake world, this is the Nietzschean critique, And that had basically psyoped everyone into believing that what was good is evil, and what's actually evil is good. And so Nietzsche had said that this slave morality, or this morality of the slaves, was culminated in Christian morality. So we can take the passage, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So Nietzsche's conception is the Romans who were trying to push this religion on the people eventually, and before them the priests. It was this conception that if you're in a state right now where you're poor and you have no power, that's actually a good thing. Whereas if you actually have power and you can go and conquer, that's actually evil. So Nietzsche's argument is that this slave morality was created as a control mechanism for the people to internalize their slavery as a virtue. And this type of philosophy for Nietzsche is actually the nihilistic philosophy. So many people will say Nietzsche was a nihilist. He dabbled with nihilism in many of his musings, but he himself was not a nihilist, technically. And what he essentially said is that Christianity was actually a nihilism, because what it did is it devalued this world. It actually negated this world. Christianity has a negation towards the value of this world, and it values a transcendental other world. And so for Nietzsche, this kind of philosophical escapism or flight from the reality of this world, because there's too much suffering for Nietzsche that the Christian cannot handle. And so they escape from the reality of suffering, which for Nietzsche is a kind of virtue. Nietzsche is famous for saying, that which does not destroy us will make us stronger. So this idea that the more suffering you endure, the more adversity you develop, and the more strength of character that you achieve, the more you ascend higher and higher up into the mountains. When you finally reach it and you see the setting sun and that horizon, and you look down on the valley, it will all appear much less to you. So for Nietzsche, struggle, adversity, practically suffering, are actually the grounds for which we become great. And to remove those and to nerf life and make suffering evil and something we should avoid makes us actually weak, makes us actually less strong. We all know many people who have had very easy lives, and they don't have, typically many of them, don't have as much of that sense of adversity because their lives have been nerfed. Many of them will crack under not a lot of pressure. So this is Nietzsche's conception that we need strife, we need conquest, we need war. Even Nietzsche actually argued war was a virtue to allow us to grow. There was an ancient Greek philosophical idea that if we could remove all strife and suffering from the universe itself, then motion itself would stop and we would all be frozen. There would be nothing actually moving, because it's this notion that fundamentally strife, suffering, war, all this sort of disharmonious elements of our existence are actually fundamental to existence itself, and that's what actually helps motion. That's actually what causes motion to move to some extent. So that's a little digression, but it's this type of conception that we want our lives to be kind of this hedonistic, joyful pleasure. And what Nietzsche is saying is we cannot actually make life like that. And if we do, we'll actually become less vital, more inferior, less strong. And if we make life more difficult, it actually is the means for us to grow. Nietzsche is famous for saying, I believe what is evil is actually good, and what's good is evil, and that we need more suffering. He famously said, I want more suffering. I want more and more and more, because that's the grounds from which we can grow. That will be the raw data which will inspire and material that will inspire our poetry, our politics, our philosophy, our music, all of the Greek values that were aesthetic, artistic expressions of this divine rationality in us. We need to celebrate that in all its vitalism for Nietzsche, and that includes tragedy and all the awful things. Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy famously said that Christianity was life's disgust with itself. So life became aware of itself and was disgusted by itself and wanted to reject the muck and the dirt and the tears and the slime of existence and transcend it into this pure idea, this Platonic form, this kingdom of heaven. And what Nietzsche is saying is that that's actually not reality. The Platonic form, which is the idea that the idea of a triangle is actually separate from any triangle that you saw, which is separate from the world. Nietzsche said that's what Christianity did with heaven, this kingdom of heaven. It had separated itself from the world, and that was life's rejection and disgust with itself. So generally speaking, we can say that the slave morality for Nietzsche is a terminology that he would eventually use in describing the will to power, this idea of a transvaluation of values. So he said everything got turned upside down. Before Christianity in the Greek world, being a loser was not a virtue, whereas for the Christian ideal, it's generally accepted that this idea of blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Pride goeth before a fall. It's easier for a rich man to enter heaven than for it's harder for it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. So what Nietzsche was saying is all these values that the Greeks had, creative splendor, artistic pride, the notion that one is an elite or aristocrat or is good and the others are not, was actually turned upside down, and that those are actually awful values, and that equality before God, or rather this pure egalitarianism, was the ultimate value. And for Nietzsche argued that this Christian conception that we are all equal before God, that no one else can judge anybody else because only God can judge us, was the first true egalitarianism. And for Nietzsche, he argued that that had actually led Christianity to influence democracy, our modern conception, not the original Greek, socialism, communism, feminism, any modern ideology for Nietzsche was fundamentally rooted in this Christian idea of we're all equal before God and no one else can judge anybody else. Whereas before, there was a conception that we are not all equal before the gods, particularly amongst the Greeks, that the Greeks' gods actually bless and favor certain people and don't otherwise, and that there's kind of a fickleness to the Greeks, Greek gods. We don't understand why they favor some and seem to curse others. So this conception that there's no such thing as luck, and that your success or failures in your existence are a consequence of the gods and their fates and their conception of fate influencing you, was something that we had turned upside down for Friedrich Nietzsche. Another famous idea of Nietzsche's is the idea of the will to power. And Nietzsche was incredibly influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer was the first true Western philosopher who was a pessimist. He was incredibly influenced by Buddhism and Immanuel Kant. And Schopenhauer had essentially made the argument that life is an oscillation between boredom and satisfaction. So we're always bored. We get what we want, but then we get bored of it, and then we want something else again. So you were dying for that Christmas gift, you couldn't wait to get it, you asked and you asked and you asked. You finally got it, 6 months go by, and you've already forgotten it, sitting there in a dusty corner, and you want something else. So Schopenhauer's argument is we're never going to be happy because dissatisfaction is our essence. This is the Schopenhauerian ideal. And what Schopenhauer argued is that we need to renounce the world. We need to reject our will because our will is always striving and it will never be happy. So what he argued is because we'll always be satisfied, stop being at the whims of your will. Just because you get hungry for junk food doesn't mean you should go get it. And what he said is we need to renounce the world, basically become a kind of monk, because the world is so evil for Schopenhauer. You'll never be not betrayed, you'll never have true lasting satisfaction for him, so we must renounce the world. So Nietzsche argued against this actually, because Schopenhauer said everything is the will to life, everything in the human experience is this striving for a will to life. So Schopenhauer had said that, for example, all our romantic love conceptions are actually this blind biological drive to reproduce. And so what Nietzsche said is that it's actually not the will to life. This doesn't actually totally make sense for Nietzsche. Nietzsche famously said what it is the will to power. And so for Nietzsche, if a father has a family, it's not for Schopenhauer this blind reproductive drive. Or, excuse me, as Schopenhauer said, it would be this blind reproductive drive. For Nietzsche, the father's only having a family to have power because he can't be a king. And he wants to influence his offspring. So it's this conception that the will to power explains politics and history, whereas something like the will to life for Schopenhauer is really, we're kind of sticking to biology, and it's much more explanatory maybe at a sort of base natural level, but even then it has issues. But nonetheless, that was the influence. So the idea that Schopenhauer influenced Nietzsche is very clear in this conception of the will to life and the will to power. This conception of the will to power, what Nietzsche was saying, is that it's connected to the idea of God is dead. And so for Nietzsche, he's famous for saying in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that God is dead. And many have said, asked the question, what does that actually mean? Of course, God couldn't literally die. The superficial level of Nietzsche's reading is that it's a critique of the rise of atheism. So as more people are becoming less religious, it's this idea that God is dead. Also, the full quote is, God is dead, for we have killed him. We are the slayers of God. We are walking around with knives dripping with God's blood. So really what Nietzsche was saying is that the people of the modern world are the descendants of the slayers of God. Now we can really get into the idea of, for example, he was an anti-Christian. And in Christianity, Christ is God. Christ is the Son of God, but also becomes God, and it's this dual essence. But nonetheless, I think there's an element of Nietzsche's critique where what he's talking about is Jesus Christ. The idea that God is dead is the idea that God was a man and man was God, and God has died. And so therefore, what he's talking about is the modern Europeans at that particular time who are embodying this kind of cultural atheism. What Nietzsche was arguing is that they were representative of the same people who in the Bible killed Christ and rejected Christ. So the people that had rejected Christ and crucified him, Nietzsche was saying it's the same cultural spirit now. There's actually a rejection of Christ through this kind of cultural atheism, particularly because Nietzsche was writing at the end of the 19th century. Most of his books were written in the 1880s, and so by that time, the cultural effects of things like evolutionary theory and the slow decay of the cultural import of Christianity in Europe had taken its effect for many years. So Nietzsche was somewhat writing about this kind of European trend, but he was also writing about, in particular, Christian theology and how it was losing its ability to give people meaning. So what Nietzsche was arguing, and this is how God is dead and the will to power tie in, because God is dead, the masses need a new morality because the old one doesn't make as much sense. It doesn't fit with the times. And so what Nietzsche said is this overman, because Nietzsche famously said humanity is something that has to be overcome. So there'll be this overman or person who's overcome and gone beyond good and evil, all these moral systems that they were once taught, and they will create a new moral system. And that will be like the old moral system for a new time, and it will replace that. So Nietzsche's conception is that because God is dead, this overman will rise up from the masses, and with his will to power will create this new moral system, and the masses will follow it. And for Nietzsche, the vast majority of people will not be able to make a new moral system. They will either follow the overman or follow the old ones. And so this conception that one must go beyond good and evil and see that history made this wrong turn, we should have went into this tragic conception instead of a celebratory conception, that as Christian morality fades away, there's a glorious opportunity for this overman to come along and to create a whole new moral system that the petit bourgeois masses who think in the old Christian ways will necessarily view as evil. But in this new moral system, it will actually be good, and the Christian morality will actually be evil. So that was Nietzsche's conception, that there's a historical relativism to our conceptions of good and evil. Even to this day, no psychologist, for example, or biologist or criminologist would mention the terms good and evil. really those are value terms linked to religion, and to some extent there's a subjectivism to them, because even terms like legal and illegal, those are very clear cut because they're reference to a state with laws. But when we're talking about good and evil, we're now getting kind of religious and we're getting a bit more subjective and fuzzy. So Nietzsche's idea really with the will to power was this conception that this overman will use this will to power to go beyond good and evil and to create this whole new moral system. Nietzsche famously thought of himself as this kind of prophet in the mountains who was somewhat getting this new moral value system and would come down from the mountains and give it to the masses. So in his famous book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which he famously said in his book Ecce Homo, his last book ever published, which was him writing about all the books he had ever published. It's Nietzsche writing about himself. It's very fascinating. If you ever want to really get into this, get into the mind of Nietzsche and what he thought about himself, Ecce Homo is the ultimate work. That phrase, Ecce Homo, means behold a man. And it's in reference in the Bible when Pontius Pilate washes his hands from Christ being crucified. And he says, behold the man, and he washes his hands. He says, I didn't do this. So basically what Nietzsche is saying, the same way they held Christ up and said, behold the man, Nietzsche is saying, here I am, behold the man. So in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has this figure, Zarathustra, and it's based on Zoroastrianism, which is a Persian dualistic religion that was pre-Christian. And what he was doing is essentially writing about this Zarathustra figure who was up in the mountains and goes back down into the world and thunderously proclaims his philosophy. It's generally understood that the figure of Zarathustra is effectively Nietzsche, and to some extent he was writing about this poetic process that he had experienced while building his philosophy. So there's obvious parallels between Zarathustra and Nietzsche himself. So the idea of the overman, God is dead, and the will to power are generally the framing ideas of his philosophy. I think the one that I can touch on now that we can get to is another famous idea of his is the eternal recurrence. Friedrich Nietzsche effectively argued that we have an infinite amount of time and a finite physical universe. So because there's an infinite amount of time, but a finite physical universe, all of the things we've ever experienced will infinitely loop, because there's only a finite amount of ways that matter could be arranged in an infinite amount of time. So by definition, the same arrangements will happen and occur over and over. There's some debate exactly, did Nietzsche totally think this true? Because, for example, he mentions the law of thermodynamics, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it's merely transformed. So there was this conception that Nietzsche was trying to even tie in a modern scientific understanding of it. But really with the notion of the eternal recurrence, we have to get into it as a thought experiment versus a true metaphysical truth claim. There's a passage in Nietzsche's writing where he says, imagine you're going to bed and all of a sudden this demon appears at the end of your bed and says, you're going to have to live every single life over and over and over again. And he said, your reaction to that will prove whether you love fate. So tied into the idea of the eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's idea of amor fati. Amor fati means love fate. So the idea is, if the demon tells you you're going to have to groundhog every single day you've ever lived over and over for infinite amounts of time, all the good and the bad, if your reaction to that is horror because you'd have to relive all the bad things you ever experienced again, he said you don't actually love your fate. If you were joyfully saying, yes, let's go relive all the bad stuff again, for Nietzsche, that's the true love of fate, because fate is inevitable. You can't change what's going to happen to you. So you have to basically love it, because otherwise would be to reject existence. So to love fate is to truly embrace existence, no matter all the bad things that are going to happen to you. I think there's a scene in Wolf of Wall Street where the character says, oh, you got divorced. Oh, you've lost your house. Good. These are good things. this is this type of love fate, that the bad stuff's going to happen, and to reject it or to be sad about it is to reject destiny and reject existence. So what Nietzsche said is, if you find out about this demon telling you your life is going to be the same over and over again, and you're quite ecstatic and you're happy to relive your existence over and over again, even the evil bad stuff, that means you truly love fate. So there's scholarly debates, how much did Nietzsche truly argue that it was a thought experiment to prove the amor fati, or how much did he truly argue it was a metaphysical truth claim? There's a famous passage in one of his letters to his friends where you can actually go in Sils Maria in Switzerland to this day and find all of his walking routes, because Nietzsche would walk all day, hours and hours, 8 to 12 hours a day he would walk, sometimes 20 miles, and from about 24 till 44, when he went mad, he would spend most of his time alone, writing and philosophizing. And there's this massive stone that he was walking and found, and this brought him the idea of this eternal recurrence, that everything would be infinitely looped over and over again. You can kind of conceive of the eternal recurrence. Some people have visualized it as the aurora boreas, or the alchemical symbol of the snake eating its own tail. Nietzsche always had a quote as well, that time was a flat circle. So this sense of cyclical time, that everything is repeating over and over and again, and much like the seasons, each year changed, but there's the same 4-season cycle. This is what Nietzsche was talking about, that there's a kind of eternal recurrence or cyclical time conception to our experience, to all of history, and that to embrace this is to truly be affirmative, to embrace that it will happen over and over again, to embrace this will to power, that at the end of the will to power, he has this passage where he talks about how all of the universe is this gnashing, monstrous energy, and it's all just devouring itself, and it's just this will to power. And to truly accept and embrace the universe is to truly accept this will to power, and to not feel that one is evil embracing it, but rather it's actually a good thing to indulge in this will to power, and celebrate our love of fate and all of existence, and not look for only the beautiful, but rather to look out for the ugly, and understand that the ugly is just as much a part of existence as everything else. So there's a part in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where Zarathustra talks about how he is the friend of the scorpion, and he is the friend of all the disgusting creatures of nature, because that is just as much a part of nature and reality as everything else. And so it's this type of view that we have swept many things under the rug because they don't enhance our sense of vitalism, but actually all those things that we think are making us weaker, whether it's pain or suffering or the conception of evil, actually are the grounds for us to grow and to become stronger. The influence with Nietzsche to some extent on our culture is very profound. He was the favorite philosopher of many important historical figures. I will make more videos about that because that's a whole rabbit hole to get into. Friedrich Nietzsche was a very controversial figure. Up until the 1960s, his name was very much associated with evil things that happened in Europe, and that was because of his sister. His sister once he had gone mad, his sister had manipulated his later writings to make him look much more like that. Walter Kaufmann was a scholar who went in around the 1960s and basically found the true Nietzsche and saved Nietzsche from this false understanding. So now we have a much more socially acceptable view of him, but there was a time where if you said you like Nietzsche at an academic dinner party, you would have people look at you in a very controversial way. So nonetheless, I think that's a very basic introduction to Nietzsche's philosophy. I just really wanted to get a few key ideas out there and give people a general introduction into his ideas. I've always said with these videos, I really want them to be as profound as I can, but also to pack as much information that's digestible as possible for the viewer. So I thank all of you for being here. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on the video. And I hope you're all doing very great, and I thank you very much.